The morning of February 21st, 1945, Iwo Jima. A Sherman tank crew watches through their periscopes as a Japanese suicide squad emerges from a hidden tunnel, magnetic mines clutched in their hands, racing toward American armor with terrifying determination. The tank commander barks orders. The 75mm gun traverses. But everyone knows the truth. By the time they fire, at least one of those Japanese soldiers will reach the hull. At least one mine will detonate. At least one crew will burn. 300 yards to the south, another Sherman sits idling near the black volcanic sand. It looks identical to every other M4A3 on this godforsaken island. Same armor. Same tracks. Same basic silhouette. But when Japanese defenders hiding in reinforced concrete pillboxes see this particular tank approaching, they don't prepare their Type 97 anti-tank grenades. They don't ready their magnetic mines. They don't calculate firing angles for their Type 1, 47mm guns. They run. Because this tank doesn't fire shells. It fires something far worse. Something that can reach into the deepest cave, the most heavily reinforced bunker, the most carefully concealed spider hole, something that turns concrete fortifications into crematoriums and underground tunnel systems into ovens, something that kills not with explosive force, but with suffocating heat and consuming flame. The Japanese have a name for these vehicles. They call them the M1 tanks, a mistranslation of the designation painted on their hulls. But American Marines have their own names: Zippo, Satan, Ronson. The one weapon that caused the Japs to leave their caves and rock crevices and run, according to 1st Marine Division records. What makes this weapon so terrifying isn't its armor, which is standard Sherman thickness. It isn't its speed, which is actually slower than a regular tank due to the extra weight. It isn't even its firepower in conventional terms, because this tank's main gun has been completely removed and replaced with something the Japanese had never encountered before. A flamethrower with a range of 120 meters, fed by 300 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel, operating at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. In the next 36 days of fighting on Iwo Jima, these 8 modified tanks will consume 10,000 gallons of napalm fuel every single day. They will be responsible for clearing more Japanese fortifications than naval bombardment, more than aerial strikes, more than conventional artillery. A company commander with the 26th Marines will state flatly that in his view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. By war's end, portable flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima will suffer casualty rates of 92%. But flame tank crews will survive at rates comparable to conventional armor. They will account for over 30% of all Japanese combat deaths on that island, not through bullets or explosives, but by incineration. They will force the complete revision of Japanese defensive doctrine, causing tank commanders who once operated with impunity to fear infantry positions that might hide these vehicles. And here's what nobody expected. These terrifying weapons weren't designed by weapons experts or military engineers. They were built in a makeshift workshop at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii by Navy construction battalions, Seabees, using improvised tools and salvaged parts. The project was led by a chemical warfare service colonel who had been given 25 Seabee technicians and told to solve an impossible problem. How do you give infantry the ability to clear reinforced Japanese positions without suffering catastrophic casualties? The answer would change Pacific War tactics forever. But to understand why these flame tanks became so psychologically devastating to Japanese forces, you need to understand what the Marines were facing before they arrived, and why conventional weapons had failed so completely. By early 1945, the American advance across the Pacific had created a terrible mathematical problem. Every island closer to Japan meant stronger Japanese defenses, deeper fortifications, and more fanatical resistance. On Tarawa in November 1943, Marines had suffered over 3,000 casualties, taking an island just 2 square miles in size. On Peleliu in September 1944, the battle that was supposed to take 3 days lasted 2 months and cost over 10,000 American casualties. The Japanese had learned from their defeats. They had abandoned the practice of meeting American landings at the beach with banzai charges that played into American firepower advantages. Instead, they had developed a new defensive doctrine, defense in depth, using fortified positions that could withstand tremendous punishment. On Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent over 6 months implementing this strategy with ruthless efficiency. His forces had constructed 11 miles of reinforced concrete tunnels, connecting hundreds of caves, pillboxes, and bunkers. Artillery positions were built with reinforced steel doors that opened only to fire, then slammed shut before American counter-battery fire could respond. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across every approach. The entire island had been transformed into a fortress, designed specifically to maximize American casualties. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American pre-invasion bombardment had proven largely ineffective against these defenses. 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial strikes had cratered the surface, but barely touched the underground networks. Battleships firing 16-inch shells could damage surface structures, but couldn't penetrate deep enough to collapse tunnel systems. Aircraft dropping 500-pound bombs could destroy individual pillboxes, but new gun positions would appear within hours as Japanese troops moved through the tunnels to reoccupy them. The mathematics of the problem were brutal. American infantry armed with M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles could not effectively engage targets inside reinforced concrete bunkers. Mortars and artillery could suppress defensive fires temporarily, but couldn't destroy the fortifications themselves. Even direct fire from Sherman tank 75mm guns often failed to penetrate the walls of Japanese pillboxes, which had been specifically designed to withstand such attacks. Marines had developed tactics using satchel charges and pole charges to destroy individual fortifications. But these required soldiers to approach within throwing distance of enemy positions, often across completely open ground. Casualty rates for assault engineers were astronomical. A satchel charge attack on a single pillbox might require 3 or 4 attempts, as successive teams were cut down before reaching their objective. The Marine Corps had tried portable flamethrowers with some success on previous islands. The M2 flamethrower, a backpack-carried weapon, could project burning fuel approximately 30 to 40 meters. When it worked, the psychological effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers who would fight to the death against rifle fire and explosives often abandoned positions when faced with flame attacks. But the M2 had severe limitations that made it almost suicidal to operate in combat. The weapon weighed 70 pounds fully loaded, making operators slow-moving targets. The bright orange flames made them instantly identifiable to every enemy soldier within visual range. The compressed gas cylinders and fuel tanks on their backs were vulnerable to small arms fire, and any penetration resulted in catastrophic explosion. Most critically, the effective range of 30 to 40 meters meant operators had to approach very close to enemy positions to use the weapon. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was measured in minutes, not hours. One military analysis from the period stated bluntly that the life expectancy was approximately 4 minutes from the time an operator first revealed himself by firing. On Iwo Jima, portable flamethrower units would sustain casualty rates approaching 92%, leaving entire battalions without trained operators. Something else was needed, something that could deliver the psychological terror and tactical effectiveness of flame weapons, but with the protection and sustainability of armoured vehicles. Something that could reach deeper into fortifications than portable flamethrowers. Something that could operate for extended periods without constant replacement of killed or wounded operators. Solution had been developing slowly across multiple Pacific campaigns, driven not by centralized planning but by field improvisation and desperate necessity. On Saipan in June 1944, Marines had experimented with mounting flamethrowers on light M3 Stuart tanks. The results showed promise, but the light armor made the vehicles vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank weapons. Colonel George F. Unmarked of the Army Chemical Warfare Service, Central Pacific Area, had been assigned to develop mechanized flamethrower systems that could support the island campaigns. Working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, Unmacht had access to a small group of CB technicians from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion, men with practical mechanical skills rather than formal engineering training. The team faced immediate challenges. They needed to mount flamethrower systems large enough to be tactically useful, but small enough to fit inside tank turrets or hull spaces. They needed fuel capacity, sufficient for sustained operations, not just brief bursts. They needed pressure systems that could propel burning liquid over 100 meters against wind and across uneven terrain, and they needed to accomplish all this using available materials and existing tank chassis, because there was no time or industrial capacity for completely new vehicle designs. The first attempts were improvised affairs. Technicians mounted infantry M1A1 flamethrowers to fire out pistol ports in tank hulls. The concept failed immediately. The flamethrowers were too weak, couldn't traverse properly, and had insufficient range. Marines trying to use them at the Battle of Araway found the weapons unwieldy and ineffective. The team tried again, this time removing the main guns from M3A1 light tanks and installing Canadian-built Ronson Mark IV flamethrowers fed by 170-gallon fuel tanks. These vehicles, designated M3A1 Satan tanks, had a range of 75 meters and proved more successful. 2 companies of Satan tanks saw action on Saipan and Tinian with encouraging results. But the M3 light tank chassis had fundamental limitations. Its thin armor made it vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank guns. Its narrow tracks struggled on soft volcanic soil and black sand beaches. And most critically, there simply weren't enough M3 tanks available for conversion. The Army had stopped producing them in favor of the more capable M4 Sherman medium tank. By late 1944, as planning for the Iwo Jima invasion intensified, it had become clear that mechanized flamethrowers would be essential for the operation. Fleet Marine Force requested 8 flame tanks for the assault, with delivery required by November 30th, 1944. The deadline was insanely tight. It was already November 15th when Pacific Command officially approved the order. Colonel Unmacht's team located 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks for conversion. This was the latest Sherman variant, with a welded hull for better structural integrity and a Ford GAA V8 engine that provided reliable power. But mounting an effective flamethrower system in a Sherman would require solving problems no one had successfully addressed before. The team needed to combine elements from 3 different flamethrower systems: the Ronson, the Navy Mark I, and several experimental Navy designs, 2 CBs, Machinist's Mate First Class A, Reicher and electricians Mate Second Class Joseph Kissel were credited with designing what became known as the CBH-1, Navy Construction Battalion Hawaii Version 1. The installation was extraordinarily complex. Each conversion required 150 pounds of welding rod to attach reinforcement brackets and mount points. 1,100 electrical connections had to be made for the ignition system, pressure controls, and turret traverse mechanisms. The cost per tank was between $20,000 and $25,000, equivalent to nearly $300,000 in current currency. The CBH-1 system operated at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, using compressed carbon dioxide as a propellant. This high pressure gave it a maximum range of 400 feet, approximately 120 meters, nearly triple the range of portable infantry flamethrowers. The flamethrower gun was mounted in place of the 75mm main gun, disguised to look like a conventional tank barrel from a distance. This camouflage was critical. The Japanese couldn't be allowed to identify flame tanks until they fired, or they would concentrate all available weapons on them. The fuel tank held 300 gallons of specially formulated napalm-thickened fuel, a mixture that would burn at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius and could not be easily extinguished with water. At maximum pressure, the CBH-1 could fire for approximately 90 seconds of continuous operation, though in practice it was fired in bursts lasting 5 to 10 seconds to conserve fuel and allow the crew to observe results. The turret could traverse 270 degrees, allowing the flamethrower to engage targets across almost a complete circle without having to reposition the entire tank. Gun elevation ranged from -12 degrees to +25 degrees, enabling the crew to shoot downward into trenches or upward into cave entrances on hillsides. On November 30th, 1944, exactly 15 days after receiving official approval, Colonel Unmacht's team delivered all 8 completed flame tanks to the Marine Corps. The achievement was remarkable, especially considering that no one on the team had ever built anything like this before. A CB electrician's mate, who would later operate one of these tanks in combat, wrote in a personal letter, "I'm using telephone wire for ignition. No spare parts as yet. They are on the ocean someplace." But nobody knew if the weapons would actually work in combat. Nobody knew if the Japanese would develop effective countermeasures. And nobody could predict whether the psychological effect would be as devastating as hoped, or whether Japanese soldiers trained to die for the Emperor would simply fight on regardless of the terror these machines could unleash. The 8 CBH-1 flame tanks landed on Iwo Jima on D-Day, February 19, 1945, but they weren't used in combat until February 21st, designated D+2 in military terminology. The delay was partly tactical. Commanders wanted to establish secure positions before committing these valuable and experimental weapons. But it was also psychological. Nobody wanted to risk losing all 8 tanks in the first hours of combat before their effectiveness could be properly assessed. When they finally went into action, the results exceeded every expectation. But to understand why these weapons had such a profound psychological impact on Japanese defenders, you need to understand the specific nature of Japanese defensive positions and why conventional weapons had failed so completely against them. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had constructed his defense around a simple principle: make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of advance. His fortifications weren't designed merely to stop American attacks. They were designed to maximize casualties while preserving Japanese combat power for as long as possible. A typical Japanese pillbox on Iwo Jima was constructed from reinforced concrete walls 1 meter thick. The concrete was strengthened with steel reinforcement bars and volcanic rock aggregate that made it extremely resistant to explosive damage. The firing apertures were small, designed to allow Japanese weapons to fire outward while presenting minimal target area for American return fire. Interior spaces were large enough to accommodate a squad of soldiers with their weapons and ammunition, typically 8 to 12 men. Multiple rooms were connected by interior passages, allowing defenders to shift position if one section was damaged. Ventilation systems drew fresh air from surface vents positioned away from the main structure, preventing simple smoke or gas attacks from being effective. Many pillboxes were connected to the tunnel network, meaning that even if American forces succeeded in destroying one, Japanese troops could simply move through underground passages and reoccupy it within hours. Marines clearing what they thought were destroyed positions would suddenly take fire from bunkers they had already cleared, leading to repeated casualties from the same locations. The tunnel systems were even more sophisticated. 11 miles of passages connected hundreds of cave positions, storage depots, command posts, and barracks areas. The tunnels were large enough for troops to move through comfortably, approximately 2 meters in height and 1.5 meters in width. They were equipped with electric lighting powered by generators, ventilation fans to provide breathable air, and secure communications lines. Cave positions offered natural protection superior to any man-made fortification. Many caves had multiple chambers connected by narrow passages that made assault extremely difficult. Defenders could retreat deeper into the cave system as Americans advanced, then emerge from side passages to attack from unexpected directions. Against these defenses, American weapons systems had proven frustratingly inadequate. Sherman tank 75mm guns could damage the exterior of pillboxes but rarely achieved penetration of the thick concrete walls. High explosive shells would crater the surface. Armor-piercing rounds would punch small holes, but the structures remained fundamentally intact and defensible. Naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers had even less effect. The shells were optimized for surface targets, and tended to either bounce off hardened structures or bury themselves in volcanic sand before detonating. The explosive energy was wasted on the ground rather than transferred to the target. Aerial bombardment faced similar problems. 500-pound bombs could destroy individual positions if they scored direct hits, but accuracy was poor, and most bombs missed their targets by considerable margins. The volcanic terrain absorbed explosive energy without transferring it effectively to underground structures. Infantry assault tactics centered on satchel charges had achieved some success, but at catastrophic cost. A satchel charge, typically containing 20 pounds of composition C2 explosive, could destroy a pillbox if placed directly against the wall near a firing aperture, but getting close enough to place the charge required crossing open ground under direct fire from multiple defensive positions. Standard assault procedure required supporting fire from tanks and artillery to suppress the target while an assault team approached. Even with this support, casualty rates were severe. Multiple attempts were often needed as successive teams were cut down. Survivors described having to crawl over the bodies of dead comrades from previous assault waves to reach their objectives. Pole charges, explosives mounted on long poles that could be shoved into firing apertures or against walls, offered slightly better standoff distance, but were heavy and awkward to maneuver. The poles were typically 10 to 15 feet long, making them difficult to carry across broken terrain while under fire. The portable M2 flamethrower represented the best option for clearing fortified positions when operators could survive long enough to use them. The psychological effect of flame weapons was undeniable. Japanese soldiers who would absorb rifle and machine gun fire without flinching, who would continue fighting with severe wounds, often broke and ran when faced with burning liquid fire. The reason was simple biology and physics. Human beings have an instinctive, primal fear of fire that transcends training and ideology. Watching burning napalm flow toward your position triggers survival responses that are almost impossible to override through discipline alone. The sound of the flamethrower firing, a distinctive roaring whoosh, became associated with horrible death in the minds of Japanese defenders. More importantly, flame weapons killed differently than conventional weapons. Bullets and explosives caused instantaneous damage to specific body parts. Soldiers could fight on through tremendous physical trauma if vital organs weren't immediately affected. But burning napalm adhered to skin and clothing, continuing to burn and spreading across the body. The agony was immediate and total. Death came from shock, from consumption of available oxygen in enclosed spaces, from catastrophic burns to the respiratory system, or eventually from thermal injury to vital organs. The tactical effectiveness came from the weapon's ability to reach into spaces that bullets and explosives couldn't effectively engage. A flamethrower burst into a pillbox aperture would flow into the interior, spreading throughout the enclosed space. Defenders couldn't hide around corners or behind internal barriers. The burning liquid would flow to fill available volume. The heat alone, even without direct contact, could cause incapacitation in enclosed spaces. But the M2's limitations remained critical. The 30 to 40 meter range meant operators had to approach perilously close to targets. The weapon's distinctive appearance and the bright flames when firing made them immediately identifiable. The weight and bulk slowed movement precisely when speed was most important, and the vulnerability to enemy fire meant that a single bullet hitting the fuel tanks or pressure cylinders could kill the operator instantly. What the Marines needed was a way to deliver flame weapon effects from beyond small arms range, with armor protection for the first operator, and with enough fuel capacity to sustain operations across multiple targets. In short, they needed exactly what Colonel Unmucht's team had created. They just didn't know yet whether it would work in actual combat. The first combat employment of CBH-1 flame tanks on Iwo Jima came on February 21, 1945, designated D+2. By this point, the Marines had secured the beaches and were attempting to advance inland, but were encountering the first major belt of Japanese fortifications. The island's southern region was dominated by Mount Suribachi, a 554-foot volcanic peak that provided the Japanese with commanding observation over the entire southern end of the island. Advancing toward Suribachi required crossing open ground swept by fire from dozens of mutually supporting pillboxes and cave positions. Initial attacks had stalled with heavy casualties. Marines were pinned down in shell craters and behind any available cover, unable to advance or retreat without taking fire from multiple directions. The 4th Marine Division requested flame tank support for an assault on a complex of 7 interconnected pillboxes that had halted their advance for more than 24 hours. Conventional tactics had failed repeatedly. Sherman tanks had fired hundreds of 75mm rounds at the position with minimal effect. Artillery had pounded the area for hours. Infantry assaults had been repulsed with severe casualties. One of the 8 CBH-1 tanks moved forward, infantry providing security against Japanese suicide squads that might attempt to disable it with magnetic mines or satchel charges. The tank commander, a young lieutenant who had never fired the weapon in combat before, positioned his vehicle approximately 100 meters from the target complex. At that range, the pillbox defenders couldn't effectively engage the tank with small arms fire. Their Type 97 anti-tank grenades had a maximum range of 30 meters. Their Type 1 47mm anti-tank guns could damage a Sherman but required clear line of sight and time to aim accurately. The flame tank crew had positioned themselves behind a slight rise in terrain that provided hull-down protection. The gunner, operating the flamethrower controls, aligned his sights on the firing aperture of the nearest pillbox. He pressed the ignition button, activating the electrical spark at the projector nozzle. Then he squeezed the trigger, opening the fuel valve and releasing compressed carbon dioxide to propel the napalm mixture forward. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. A stream of burning liquid shot from the tank's gun barrel, arcing through the air and impacting directly on the pillbox aperture. The napalm, thick and adhesive, clung to the concrete around the opening and flowed through the gap into the interior. Within seconds, flames were visible through other apertures and ventilation openings as the burning fuel spread throughout the enclosed space. Japanese soldiers inside the pillbox had 3 choices, all of them bad. They could stay inside and burn to death as temperature rose to lethal levels. They could abandon their position and flee, exposing themselves to the Marine infantry waiting outside. Or they could attempt to continue fighting despite the flames and heat, which was physically impossible once the napalm began consuming available oxygen. Some defenders attempted to run. Marine riflemen cut them down as they emerged from the position. Others remained inside, and the Marines could hear their screams even from 100 meters away. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds from the first flame burst to complete silence from the pillbox. The tank commander directed his gunner to the next target in the complex. Another burst of flame, another pillbox transformed from a defensive strongpoint into a crematorium, then the third, and the fourth. In less than 20 minutes, the CBH-1 had neutralized all 7 pillboxes that had held up the Marine advance for more than a day. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders in nearby positions was immediate and profound. As word spread of what the Americans had deployed, resistance in adjacent sectors began to collapse. Japanese soldiers who had fought fanatically for days, who had absorbed artillery and naval gunfire without retreating, began abandoning positions at the first sign of a flame tank approaching. But the most significant psychological impact wasn't on the soldiers being directly attacked. It was on the defenders who watched from other positions and survived to report what they had seen. Japanese soldiers began to understand that the concrete fortifications they had built, the positions they believed made them safe from American weapons, offered no protection whatsoever against these new vehicles. The terror spread through the Japanese defensive network like wildfire. Soldiers in positions not yet attacked began to fear that they would be next. The caves and tunnels that had seemed like sanctuaries became potential death traps if a flame tank appeared at the entrance. Every American tank became potentially one of these weapons until it revealed itself as conventional or flame, and by the time you knew which kind it was, it might be too late to escape. A captured Japanese lieutenant, interviewed after the battle, described the psychological impact with stark clarity. "We were not afraid of your rifles or your grenades. We knew we could die with honor fighting against such weapons. But the flame tanks, those were different. You could not fight them with honor. You could only burn. The comment revealed the deeper psychological dimension of the flame tank's effectiveness. In Japanese military culture, death in combat was acceptable, even honorable, if it came while fighting to the last. But death by incineration, trapped in an enclosed space with no possibility of resistance, felt fundamentally dishonorable. It was death without the possibility of resistance, without the chance to sell one's life dearly. This psychological effect was precisely what American commanders had hoped for, but had not dared to expect would be so powerful. Over the following days, the pattern repeated across Iwo Jima. As more Marines encountered Japanese fortifications, they called for flame tank support. And as more Japanese defenders experienced or witnessed flame attacks, the terror spread further through their defensive network. By February 25th, just 4 days after the first combat use, Marine infantry units were routinely delaying their assaults until flame tanks could be brought forward. Since each Marine tank battalion had only 4 flame tanks assigned, with the remaining being conventional gun tanks, there was constant competition for their availability. Units would literally hold up their advances until a flame tank could be dispatched to their sector. The operational reality quickly became apparent to both sides. The flame tanks weren't being assigned to specific units. Instead, they were pooled at central refueling locations and dispatched wherever they were most urgently needed. A Marine company pinned down by a network of caves would radio for support. The flame tank would arrive, clear the positions in minutes, then move on to the next call for assistance. This system maximized the psychological impact. Japanese defenders never knew where the flame tanks would appear next. Every sector became potentially vulnerable. The psychological pressure was constant and unrelenting. The tank's effectiveness went beyond simple destruction of fortifications. One CB electrician's mate, who actually operated a flame tank in frontline combat for 20 days, wrote in a personal letter from Iwo Jima describing a typical engagement. "One day we were assigned a pocket to burn out. We did in 6 hours, with 4 loads of fuel. What a call. Tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for 5 days. The infantry would sooner see 1 flamethrower tank than a dozen with 75s. The comment captured an important tactical reality. A conventional Sherman with a 75mm gun could fire shells at a pillbox all day without achieving decisive results. But a flame tank could clear the same position in seconds. The difference in tactical efficiency was so dramatic that infantry universally preferred flame tank support over conventional armor. Despite the flame tanks having no main gun for general fire support, the 4th Tank Battalion's after-action report stated flatly, "The flamethrower was probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima." The 23rd Regimental Combat Team reported, "Highly successful. Because of their great utility, more large flamethrower tanks should be provided." The 5th Tank Battalion recommended, "The new flame tank is an extremely effective piece of equipment. There should be a company of these tanks per tank battalion." But perhaps the most significant endorsement came from the commander of the 5th Marine Division, who stated, "Events proved that the flamethrower tank was the most important single weapon available to this division." These weren't minor commendations or polite tactical observations. Senior commanders were stating categorically that an experimental weapon built by Seabees in a makeshift workshop had proven more important than naval gunfire, more important than aerial bombardment, more important than conventional artillery. In the desperate mathematics of Iwo Jima, where every yard cost American lives, the flame tanks had changed the equation. The Japanese response to the flame tanks revealed just how psychologically devastating they had become. Traditional Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized holding positions to the death, fighting until overrun, then conducting counterattacks to retake lost ground. But against flame tanks, this doctrine collapsed. Japanese soldiers began abandoning positions as soon as they identified a flame tank approaching, even before it fired. According to a 1st Marine Division history article, the flame tanks were the one weapon that caused the Japs to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. This was unprecedented. Japanese defenders, who had withstood days of conventional bombardment, were fleeing at the mere sight of these vehicles. The few attempts at organized resistance against flame tanks demonstrated why terror was the appropriate response. Japanese suicide squads, armed with magnetic mines, tried to assault the vehicles using the same tactics they had employed against conventional Shermans. But the Marine infantry security teams surrounding the flame tanks cut down these attacks before they could close to effective range. Some Japanese soldiers attempted to target the flame tanks with their Type 147mm anti-tank guns, but the tank's armor proved sufficient to defeat these relatively light weapons. The Sherman's frontal armor was 63.5mm thick, more than adequate against Japanese anti-tank guns designed to penetrate lighter Chinese armor. The most desperate Japanese countermeasure was to try to collapse tunnel entrances before flame tanks could reach them, sealing themselves inside rather than face the burning death. But this merely trapped them in positions where they couldn't fight, accomplishing the American objective without the Americans even having to attack. By early March 1945, the psychological advantage had become so pronounced that American infantry began following flame tanks in preference to conventional armor. According to official reports, U.S. troops preferred to follow them over standard armor for the fear they put in the enemy. The flame tanks had become not just weapons, but psychological force multipliers that made every other tactic more effective. The fuel consumption told the story of their intensive employment. The 8 CBH-1 flame tanks consumed approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm fuel every single day of the Iwo Jima campaign. Over the 36-day battle, that totaled 360,000 gallons of napalm used specifically by the flame tanks, not counting the portable flamethrowers that infantry continued to employ. To put that in perspective, each tank's 300-gallon fuel load allowed approximately 90 seconds of continuous firing. At 10,000 gallons per day across 8 tanks, the crews were conducting hundreds of separate flame attacks daily. The intensity of employment was extraordinary, and the results were proportional. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Post-battle analysis attempted to quantify the flame tank's contribution to the overall RAND victory. The official assessment concluded that over 30% of all Japanese combat deaths on Iwo Jima were caused directly by flamethrowers, both portable and tank-mounted. Given that approximately 18,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island, this meant flame weapons killed roughly 5,400 enemy troops. The 8 CBH-1 flame tanks, operating for 36 days, had been responsible for a significant portion of those deaths. More importantly, they had cleared hundreds of fortified positions that would otherwise have required prolonged infantry assaults with severe American casualties. The casualty comparison between portable flamethrower operators and flame tank crews was particularly telling. Portable flamethrower units on Iwo Jima sustained casualty rates approaching 92%, leaving entire battalions without trained operators within days of landing. In contrast, flame tank crews suffered casualty rates comparable to conventional tank crews, approximately 15 to 20% across the campaign. This disparity illustrated the fundamental advantage of armored flame weapons. They could deliver the same psychological and tactical effects as portable flamethrowers, but with vastly improved crew survivability. An infantry flamethrower operator who was killed or wounded after 4 minutes of combat could be replaced, but training new operators took time that wasn't available during the battle. A flame tank that survived to refuel and rearm could continue operations indefinitely. The success at Iwo Jima immediately influenced planning for subsequent operations. In November 1944, even before Iwo Jima, the Fleet Marine Force had requested 54 mechanized flamethrowers, 9 for each Marine division. After the battle reports from Iwo Jima arrived, that number was deemed insufficient. For the Okinawa invasion in April 1945, the 10th Army decided that the entire 713th Tank Battalion would convert to flame tanks. The battalion was ordered to Schofield Barracks in November 1944, where Colonel Unmacht's Seabees supervised the conversion of all 54 of their M4A3 Shermans to Ronson flamethrowers. These later conversions used Ronson flamethrower systems rather than the CBH-1 design. The Ronson had shorter range than the CBH-1, approximately 75 meters compared to 120 meters, but was simpler to install and maintain. The trade-off was acceptable given the increased numbers available. The Okinawa campaign, lasting 82 days from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945, provided an even larger test of flame tank effectiveness. The Japanese had constructed defensive positions even more elaborate than Iwo Jima, with thousands of caves and tunnel complexes honeycombing the limestone ridges that dominated the island's southern region. The 713th Tank Battalion Flame tanks proved as psychologically devastating on Okinawa as the CBH-1S had been on Iwo Jima. The battalion consumed 200,000 gallons of napalm during the campaign, clearing countless fortified positions and breaking through defensive lines that had stalled conventional forces. Army reports from Okinawa stated that the flame tanks had a psychological presence on the battlefield that exceeded their purely tactical value. This was military bureaucratic language for an extraordinary admission. The fear these weapons inspired was as important as their actual destructive capability. The improved CBH-2 design, which Colonel Unmacht's team had developed as a successor to the CBH-1, featured even better performance. The CBH-2 could reach 150 yards, approximately 137 meters, giving it standoff capability that kept the tank beyond effective range of virtually all Japanese infantry anti-tank weapons. By mid-1945, development of even more advanced variants was underway. The POACWSH-5 auxiliary flamethrower mounted coaxially to the 75mm main gun, allowing a single tank to function as both a flame weapon and conventional gun tank. This addressed one of the few limitations of the earlier designs, their inability to provide general fire support for infantry. But the war ended before these improved designs could see combat. In June 1945, the Army cancelled all further production orders for M4 Sherman tanks as the war in Europe concluded, and production resources were redirected toward the planned invasion of Japan. This cancellation threatened the flame tank program, but Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson intervened personally, placing an expedite order on Colonel Unmacht's production. The flame tanks were given AAA procurement priority, the same priority level assigned to the B-29 Superfortress bomber program and the atomic bomb development at Los Alamos. This extraordinary priority reflected high-level recognition that mechanized flamethrowers would be absolutely critical for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Marine Corps ordered 72 additional flame tanks for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. Colonel Unmacht's CB crews had 70 of them ready by victory over Japan Day in August 1945. In total, Unmacht's flame tank group produced 354 flame tanks during the war. The weapons would never be used in their intended role. Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki meant the invasion of the home islands never occurred. But planning documents and intelligence assessments make clear that the flame tanks would have been essential for that operation. Japanese home island defenses were projected to be orders of magnitude stronger than anything encountered on Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Intelligence estimated that Japan had prepared thousands of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions across Kyushu and Honshu. Casualty projections for an invasion ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead, with Japanese military and civilian deaths in the millions. In this nightmare scenario, flame tanks would have been the primary weapon for clearing fortifications without catastrophic American casualties. The psychological terror they inspired, proven across multiple Pacific campaigns, would have been essential for breaking Japanese resistance without requiring the destruction of every position through conventional assault. The flame tank's psychological impact on Japanese defensive planning was already evident by mid-1945. Captured documents and post-war interrogations revealed that Japanese commanders recognized they had no effective countermeasure against mechanized flamethrowers. Defensive positions that had seemed impregnable now appeared vulnerable. The calculated trade of American lives for time, which had been the foundation of Japanese defensive strategy, no longer worked when Americans could clear positions with minimal casualties. After Japan's surrender, flame tank development continued briefly before being curtailed. The POACWSH-5 coaxial flamethrower remained in Marine service and saw action during the Korean War, particularly during the Incheon landing and subsequent operations. But by the late 1950s, changing tactical doctrines and the development of other weapons systems reduced emphasis on flame weapons. The last flame tank, the M132 armored flamethrower based on the M113 armored personnel carrier, was used successfully during the Vietnam War. But by 1978, flamethrowers and flame tanks had been removed from the US arsenal entirely, victim of changing military priorities and international concerns about their humanitarian implications. The men who built and operated these weapons largely returned to obscurity after the war. Colonel George F. Unmarked went back to peacetime military service. His contribution to the Pacific victory, known primarily within chemical warfare service circles. The Seabees, who had improvised the CBH-1 design, men like machinists mate first-class Reicher and electricians mate second-class Kissel, returned to civilian life with little public recognition of what they had accomplished. The flame tank crews, who had operated these terrifying weapons in the most desperate battles of the Pacific War, rarely spoke of their experiences. The nature of flame warfare was too horrific, too psychologically disturbing for casual conversation. Many suffered nightmares for years afterward, haunted by the sounds and smells of what their weapons had done to enemy soldiers. One tank commander, interviewed decades after the war, described the psychological burden. "You never forget it. The sound of the screaming, the smell. People think flame weapons are somehow cleaner than bullets or explosives, but they're not. They're more terrible than anything I saw in the war, but they saved American lives. That's what we told ourselves then, and that's what I tell myself now." The moral complexity of flame weapons has been debated since their introduction in World War I. Critics argued that burning enemy soldiers to death was uniquely cruel and violated principles of humane warfare. Defenders pointed out that any weapon that killed was by definition inhumane, and that flame weapons actually shortened battles and reduced total casualties by forcing quick surrender or flight rather than prolonged resistance. What's undeniable is the specific psychological impact these weapons had on Japanese forces in the Pacific War. The terror they inspired was fundamentally different from the fear induced by conventional weapons. Japanese soldiers trained to accept death with honor found themselves facing a form of death that felt dishonorable and unavoidable. The cultural dimension was significant. Japanese military ideology emphasized fighting spirit, individual courage, and death before surrender. These principles could sustain resistance against bullets and explosives, where individual will and courage might make a difference in survival. But against flame weapons in enclosed spaces, courage was irrelevant. The burning liquid couldn't be fought with determination or tactical skill. This psychological dynamic, more than the weapon's physical destructiveness, explained their extraordinary effectiveness. The flame tanks didn't just destroy fortifications, they destroyed the psychological foundation of Japanese defensive doctrine. Positions that seemed impregnable became death traps. The willingness to die for the emperor couldn't protect against burning napalm. The mathematical trade of American lives for time collapsed when Americans could clear positions without casualties. In hindsight, the flame tanks represented an intersection of technological innovation, tactical necessity, and psychological warfare that rarely aligns so perfectly. The weapons were developed rapidly by improvising technicians rather than formal engineers. They were deployed in response to immediate tactical problems rather than long-term strategic planning, and they achieved results far beyond what their creators had hoped or expected. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines on Iwo Jima, perhaps said it best in his post-battle assessment. In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. Coming from a Marine officer who had seen every weapon system the United States could deploy, including naval gunfire from battleships and aerial bombardment from B-29 seconds, this statement carried tremendous weight. The flame tanks had won Iwo Jima not because they killed more enemy soldiers than other weapons, though they killed many, but because they broke the enemy's will to resist. From prepared positions, they transformed the tactical calculus from one where every fortification required an infantry assault with expected casualties to one where fortifications could be neutralized systematically, with minimal American losses. This transformation had strategic implications beyond individual battles. The flame tanks proved that technological innovation could solve tactical problems that appeared unsolvable through conventional means. The 70-meter range, mentioned in the title, derived from some of the Ronson configurations, represented the critical standoff distance where armored flame weapons could engage fortifications beyond the effective range of Japanese infantry anti-tank weapons. But the more important figure was the 120 meters achieved by the CBH-1 design, which gave flame tanks the ability to engage targets from positions where return fire was essentially impossible. This range made the psychological terror complete. Japanese soldiers couldn't fight back, couldn't maneuver, couldn't do anything except die or flee. The broader historical lesson extends beyond World War II. The flame tanks demonstrated that in modern warfare, psychological effects can be as important as physical destruction. The terror these weapons inspired multiplied their tactical effectiveness far beyond their actual destructive capability. A weapon that forced the enemy to abandon positions without fighting was, in many ways, more valuable than one that destroyed the positions with the enemy still inside. This principle has influenced military thinking ever since. Modern precision-guided munitions, psychological operations, and electronic warfare all aim to achieve effects beyond simple physical destruction. The goal is to break the enemy's will to resist, to make fighting seem futile, to create conditions where surrender or flight appears more rational than continued resistance. The flame tanks of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were perhaps the first weapons system in modern warfare to achieve this psychological dominance so completely. They weren't the most powerful weapons deployed in the Pacific War. They weren't the most sophisticated. They weren't even the most numerous. But in terms of psychological impact per unit deployed, they may have been the most effective weapons the United States fielded during World War II. The tragic irony was that this effectiveness came from weaponizing humanity's most primal fear. Fire has terrified humans since before recorded history. The flame tanks simply took that ancient terror and mounted it on modern armor, creating a weapon that attacked the human psyche as much as the human body. Japanese defenders recognized this immediately. One captured officer's comment, documented in intelligence reports, captured the psychological dimension perfectly. Your other weapons kill the body. The flame tanks kill the spirit before they kill the body. In the desperate mathematics of the Pacific War, where every island cost thousands of American lives, this spiritual destruction proved militarily necessary. The flame tanks saved American lives by breaking Japanese resistance efficiently and decisively. The horror they inflicted on enemy soldiers had to be weighed against the American casualties prevented. This moral calculus has troubled historians and ethicists for decades. Were flame weapons more or less humane than conventional weapons? Did the quick psychological collapse they induced actually reduce total suffering compared to prolonged conventional battles? There are no simple answers to these questions. What's certain is that the men who built these weapons, operated them, and called for their support, believed they were doing the right thing in the context of total war. The Seabees, who stayed up all night welding flamethrower mounts onto Sherman hulls, believed they were saving Marine lives. The tank crews who fired napalm into Japanese pillboxes believed they were shortening the war and preventing American casualties. The Marines who requested flame tank support believed they were using the most effective tool available for an incredibly difficult job. The Japanese soldiers who faced these weapons, and the few who survived to tell of it, saw things differently. To them, The flame tanks represented a form of warfare that crossed boundaries they believed should not be crossed. Death in combat was acceptable, but death by incineration felt like something else entirely. Yet even in Japanese post-war accounts, there's a grudging recognition that the flame tanks were militarily effective in ways that conventional weapons were not. Japanese defensive doctrine had been optimized to trade American lives for time. The flame tanks disrupted this equation by clearing fortifications without requiring infantry assaults. In purely military terms, they were a brilliant solution to a tactical problem. The Pacific War was, fundamentally, a war of fortified islands where every defensive position required assault. Conventional tactics meant accepting severe casualties to clear these positions. The flame tanks offered an alternative, psychological terror that forced abandonment of positions without assault. In the brutal logic of total war, this was not just acceptable, but preferable. The 70 to 120-meter range of these weapons was critical to their success. At these distances, flame tanks could engage fortifications from positions where Japanese defenders had no effective response. They couldn't fight back with small arms, their anti-tank weapons were out of range or ineffective, and their only option was to flee or die. This technological advantage, combined with the primal human fear of fire, created a weapon system whose psychological impact far exceeded its physical destructiveness. The flame tanks didn't just clear fortifications, they broke the Japanese will to defend them. They transformed prepared positions from assets into liabilities. They made the very act of fortification seem futile. In the final accounting, the flame tanks were one of the most cost-effective weapons systems the United States deployed in World War II. Each tank cost $25,000 to convert. 8 tanks at Iwo Jima, operating for 36 days, helped secure an island that cost nearly 7,000 American lives, but would have cost far more without them. 54 tanks at Okinawa helped break defensive lines that might otherwise have required months of additional fighting. The 354 flame tanks produced by Colonel Unmacht's team represented a total investment of under $9 million. Compare this to the billions spent on other weapons systems, and the return on investment was extraordinary. Not because the flame tanks destroyed more targets than other weapons, but because they destroyed the enemy's will to defend targets. This lesson in psychological warfare, learned through desperate innovation in the Pacific, would influence American military thinking for decades. The flame tanks proved that understanding the enemy's psychology and exploiting their fears could be as important as overwhelming them with firepower. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.